The mist rolled thick across the Oconee River that October night, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and something darker. Blood, fresh and warm against the cooling earth. Thomas Caldwell urged his horse forward through the underbrush, his rifle balanced across his saddle, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Behind him, 4 other men followed, their torches casting dancing shadows that made the forest seem alive with ghosts. "She can't have gone far," growled Marcus Webb, the largest of the group, his face ruddy from exertion and whiskey. "Not with a baby. We heard it crying not 10 minutes ago." They'd been tracking the runaway slave woman for 3 days, ever since she'd disappeared from the Hartwell plantation with her newborn infant. The reward for her return was substantial. $50 for the woman, though nobody expected to bring her back alive now. She'd made the mistake of running north instead of following the river south, and that error had cost her dearly. Caldwell had put a bullet in her back around sunset, somewhere near the old creek bed. She'd fallen hard, but when they'd reached the spot, all they'd found was blood, a lot of it, and the trail leading deeper into the forest. "Something ain't right about this," muttered John Pierce, the youngest of the hunters, barely 20 years old, with hands that still shook when he fired his weapon. "What are you thinking about this story? Your opinion is incredibly important to us. Please subscribe, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and let us know if you're enjoying this tale. We truly value your feedback. It helps us create better content for you. These woods. My daddy always said the Cherokee used to consider them sacred. Said there were spirits here that didn't take kindly to—" "Your daddy was a drunk and a fool," Webb cut him off. "Ain't no spirits. Just trees and animals and one dead Negro woman who's probably already been torn apart by wolves. We find the baby, we might still get something for our trouble. Some of them plantation owners, they buy children cheap, raise 'em up to work." Caldwell held up his hand, bringing the group to a halt. In the distance, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pines, came the unmistakable sound of an infant crying. It was weak, desperate, the kind of sound that pulled at something primal in a man's chest whether he wanted it to or not. "There," Caldwell pointed toward a dense thicket of mountain laurel about 50 yards ahead. "Quiet now. Don't want to spook it into going silent." They dismounted, moving on foot now, weapons ready. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen pine needles that muffled their footsteps, but Caldwell couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He'd hunted these woods for 15 years, tracked everything from deer to deserters, and he knew the difference between normal forest sounds and something else. Something waiting. The crying grew louder as they approached the thicket. Webb pushed aside the laurel branches with the barrel of his rifle, his torch held high. The light fell across a small clearing, and there, nestled in a hollow at the base of an ancient oak, was a bundle of torn fabric. "Got it," Webb grinned, reaching down toward the bundle. That's when Caldwell saw it, a flash of copper-colored skin in the moonlight. There and gone in an instant, moving through the trees with impossible speed. He spun, bringing his rifle up, but there was nothing, just shadows and mist. "Did you see that?" Pierce whispered, his voice tight with fear. "See what?" Webb had the bundle in his hands now, but his expression had changed from triumph to confusion. "It's just rags." "There ain't no baby here!" Caldwell felt ice slide down his spine. The crying had stopped the moment Webb touched the bundle, cut off as cleanly as if someone had closed a door. He turned slowly, scanning the tree line, and that's when he saw her. She stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the darkness, a woman with long black hair that seemed to blend with the night itself. She wore deerskin clothing decorated with beads and quillwork, and in her arms, wrapped in a blanket of woven river grass, was the baby. The infant was quiet now, peaceful, one small hand pressed against the woman's chest. "Cherokee," Webb breathed, raising his rifle. "They're supposed to be gone. Government moved them all out 2 years back." The woman didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, her dark eyes reflecting the torchlight like an animal's, watching them with an expression that Caldwell couldn't quite read. It wasn't fear. He knew fear when he saw it. This was something else, something ancient and patient and utterly without mercy. "Ma'am," Caldwell said carefully, lowering his weapon slightly, "that baby belongs to the Hartwell plantation. We're lawfully obligated to return it. You best hand it over, and we'll forget we saw you here." For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest held its breath. Then the woman smiled, and Caldwell felt his blood turn to ice water. It wasn't a human smile. It was the smile of a wolf watching prey stumble into a trap. She spoke then, her voice soft, but carrying clearly through the still air, words in a language Caldwell didn't understand. Cherokee, he supposed, though he'd never heard it spoken. The syllables seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and as she spoke, the forest around them began to change. The mist grew thicker, coiling around their legs like living things. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Caldwell could see his breath fogging in the torchlight, and from somewhere in the darkness, something howled. Not a wolf, not quite, but something close enough to make every man there grip his weapon tighter. "Shoot her!" Webb snarled, raising his rifle. The gunshot cracked through the forest like thunder, echoing off the hills. But where the woman had been standing there was nothing. Just empty air and swirling mist. The baby's cry rose again, but now it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the trees, impossible to locate. "Where'd she go?" Pierce spun in a circle, his torch held high. "Where the hell did she go?" Caldwell backed toward the horses, every instinct he had screaming at him to run. In 30 years of hunting, tracking and fighting, he'd never felt fear like this. Not in the war, not facing down armed deserters, not even when he'd been cornered by a wounded bear in the mountains. This was different. This was the fear of something beyond his understanding, something that operated by rules he didn't know. "We're leaving," he said, his voice rough. "Now." "The hell we are," Webb argued. "That woman's got property that belongs—" The scream cut him off. It came from behind them, where their horses were tethered, and it was cut short with a wet, gurgling sound that made Caldwell's stomach turn. They ran back toward the animals, bursting through the undergrowth into the small clearing where they'd left them. The horses were gone. In their place, arranged in a careful circle on the ground, were 5 feathers. Red-tailed hawk feathers, Caldwell recognized, the kind the Cherokee used in their ceremonies. And in the center of the circle, written in what looked like red clay, was a symbol he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. A warning. "Sweet, merciful God," Pierce whispered. And Caldwell heard the young man's rifle clatter to the ground as his nerve finally broke. "We need to get out of these woods. We need to get out now." For once, Caldwell agreed. They ran, crashing through the underbrush without care for direction or dignity, their torches casting wild shadows that seemed to reach for them with grasping fingers. Behind them, the baby's cry followed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, always just out of reach. And threading through it, barely audible, was the sound of a woman singing. A lullaby in a language as old as the hills themselves. They didn't stop running until they reached the river road 3 miles south, where the forest finally opened up into farmland, and the first grey light of dawn was touching the eastern sky. Caldwell bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. His expensive coat was torn, his rifle lost somewhere in the mad flight through the darkness. The others looked no better. Webb had a gash across his forehead from a low-hanging branch, Pierce was crying openly, and the other 2 men were pale as ghosts. "What was that?" one of them finally asked. "What in God's name was that?" Caldwell straightened slowly, looking back at the dark line of trees that marked the forest edge. The sun was rising now, burning away the mist, making everything look normal and safe and explainable, but he knew what he'd seen. He knew what had happened in those woods. "That," he said quietly, "was something that doesn't want to be found, and something that's going to make damn sure we never come back." He was right about the second part. but wrong about the first. Because in the years that followed, people would see her, the Cherokee woman who walked the ridges with a child who grew but never quite seemed to age. They'd see them on moonlit nights, moving through the forests that were supposed to be empty, tending to the sick, guiding lost travelers, protecting runaway slaves from the hunters who pursued them. And one by one, those hunters who'd been in the forest that October night would meet their ends. Some said it was coincidence, others knew better. Because each body, when found, would be marked the same way, with red clay and feathers, and a symbol that none of the white settlers could read, but all of them learned to fear. The Cherokee word for vengeance is the same as the word for balance. And Salali, whose name meant squirrel in her grandmother's tongue, small but fierce, quick but patient, had learned long ago that some debts could only be paid in blood. 3 weeks after the incident in the forest, Thomas Caldwell woke in his farmhouse to find his bedroom door wide open and a single hawk feather lying on his pillow. His wife hadn't heard anything. The dogs hadn't barked. There were no footprints in the dust of the yard, no sign of forced entry, nothing to explain how someone had entered his locked house, climbed the stairs, and left their calling card inches from his sleeping face. He burned the feather and said nothing to anyone. But he started sleeping with his rifle and kept a candle burning all night. Marcus Webb wasn't so careful. He'd spent the week since their forest encounter drinking heavily at the tavern in Watkinsville, telling anyone who'd listen about the Cherokee witch and her stolen baby, embellishing the story with each retelling until he had them surrounded by a dozen spirits and fighting their way out against impossible odds. Some men laughed, others bought him drinks to hear more. But the older folks, the ones who remembered when the Cherokee still lived in these hills, they'd grow quiet and leave when Webb started talking. "You shouldn't speak of such things," old Samuel Pritchard told him one night, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "The Cherokee, they had ways, still do I reckon, ways that don't die just because the government moves people west. You mark a woman's child for death, she marks you right back. That's the old law." Webb laughed and ordered another whiskey. "Old man, you're as superstitious as a Negro. There ain't no magic, there ain't no curses, just a savage woman in the woods who got lucky." Pritchard shook his head and left. That was November 15th. On November 17th, Webb's body was found in the Oconee River, tangled in the roots of a fallen cypress tree. The official cause of death was drowning, likely while drunk. But the men who pulled him from the water told a different story in hushed voices, about the red clay marks on his chest, the hawk feather clutched in his dead hand, and the expression of absolute terror frozen on his face. Caldwell heard about it and felt his heart sink. He'd been hoping it was over, that whatever had happened in the forest was finished. But now he knew better. This wasn't finished. This was just beginning. He found John Pierce working in his father's tobacco field, trying to act like everything was normal, but jumping at every shadow. The young man had lost weight, dark circles under his eyes, testimony to sleepless nights. "We need to talk," Caldwell said without preamble, "about what happened, about Webb." Pierce's face went white. "That was an accident. He was drunk. He fell in the river, that's all." "You know that's not all. She's coming for us, Pierce, one by one. We need to figure out what to do." "What can we do?" Pierce's voice cracked. "You think we can fight a spirit? You think rifles and dogs are going to stop whatever she is?" Caldwell had been thinking about that for weeks. "She's not a spirit. She's a woman. Cherokee, yes, and she knows these woods better than we do, but she's flesh and blood. Has to be. And if she's flesh and blood, she can be stopped. Then why hasn't anyone stopped her before? The government spent months rounding up every Cherokee in Georgia, thousands of them. How'd she slip through?" It was a good question. The Trail of Tears, they were calling it now. The forced removal of the Cherokee Nation from their ancestral lands. Soldiers had swept through these hills 2 years ago, rooting out every man, woman, and child they could find, marching them west to Oklahoma Territory. The operation had been thorough, brutal, and complete, or so everyone thought. "Maybe she wasn't here then," Caldwell suggested. "Maybe she came back after." "Or maybe," Pierce said quietly, "she was never really here at all. Maybe she's something else, something that just looks like a woman." Caldwell wanted to argue, but he couldn't, because the truth was, nothing about that night in the forest had made sense. The way she'd moved, the way she'd vanished, the way the very air had seemed to change around her, it defied explanation. And now Webb was dead, marked with the same symbols they'd seen in the forest, and Caldwell knew in his bones that he was next, unless he did something about it. "I'm going to find her," he announced, "going to track her down and end this." Pierce stared at him. "You're insane. You saw what she can do." "I saw tricks and shadows. I'm going back to those woods, and I'm going to find where she's hiding, and when I do, I'm going to finish what we started." "Then you're going alone," Pierce said flatly. "I'm not going back there, not for any amount of money." Caldwell left him in the field and spent the next 2 days preparing. He bought new ammunition, sharpened his knife, and studied every map of the region he could find. The Oconee River Valley was rough country. Mountains and hollows and hidden caves where a person could disappear for years if they knew the land. But there were patterns to follow, water sources, game trails, places where someone living off the land would have to go eventually. He also made inquiries carefully about Cherokee, who might still be in the area. Most people thought they were all gone, but there were rumors. A trader named Morrison claimed he'd seen smoke from a campfire in the hills north of the river. A farmer swore he'd found fresh moccasin tracks near his cornfield. And there was talk of a cave system up in the high country, places the soldiers hadn't searched because they were too remote, too dangerous. That's where Caldwell decided to start. On November 20th, 3 days after Webb's body was found, he set out alone into the mountains, following the narrow trails that led into the wilderness where few white men dared to venture. The weather was turning cold, frost in the mornings, and the first hints of winter in the air. Caldwell moved carefully, watching for signs, listening for sounds that didn't belong. He knew he was being foolish, knew that tracking a woman who could vanish like smoke was probably suicide. But he also knew he couldn't live the rest of his life waiting for a feather to appear on his pillow, waiting for red clay marks to be found on his dead body. Better to die fighting than to die afraid. He found the first sign on the second day. A mark on a tree, carved with a knife, showing the way to something. It wasn't Cherokee writing, not exactly, but it was clearly intentional. A message, or a trap. Caldwell followed it. The marks led him higher into the mountains, away from the river valley and into country so remote he doubted white men had ever set foot there. The trees grew thicker here, old-growth pines and hardwoods that blocked out the sun, creating a permanent twilight even at midday. And everywhere there was the sense of being watched, of eyes in the darkness, of something just beyond his vision. On the third day, he found the cave. It was hidden behind a waterfall, the entrance obscured by the cascade and the mist it created. Caldwell only spotted it because the water flow was low this time of year, revealing the dark opening in the rock face. He stood at the edge of the pool, looking up at that black mouth, and felt fear unlike anything he'd experienced since childhood. This was it. This was her place. He knew it the way he knew his own name. Caldwell checked his rifle, made sure his powder was dry, and started climbing. The rocks were slippery with moss and spray, but he managed, pulling himself up the steep face until he could scramble through the waterfall and into the cave beyond. Inside it was dark and cool, the sound of falling water echoing off stone walls. Caldwell lit his small lantern and held it high, the flickering light revealing a passage that led deeper into the mountain. The floor was smooth, worn by centuries of water and feet, and on the walls were paintings, ancient Cherokee artwork showing hunters and animals and stories Caldwell couldn't begin to understand. He moved forward, his rifle in one hand and the lantern in the other, every nerve screaming at him to turn back. But he kept going, driven by anger and fear and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he could end this. The passage opened into a larger chamber, and that's where Caldwell saw them. The woman, Salali, though he didn't know her name yet, sat by a small fire, her back to him. She was singing softly, the same lullaby he'd heard in the forest, her voice echoing off the stone, and in her lap, wrapped in blankets, was the baby. Except it wasn't a baby anymore. It was a child, maybe 2 or 3 years old, far older than it should have been after only 3 weeks. Caldwell's hands shook. Time moved differently here, had to. Or else nothing made sense. "I knew you'd come," Salali said without turning around, speaking perfect English now. "Men like you always come back. You think violence can solve everything. You think if you kill what you fear, the fear will die too." "You murdered Webb," Caldwell managed. "Left him marked like an animal." "I gave him what he gave that child's mother," Salali replied calmly. "Terror, pain, death. Is that not justice?" She turned then, and Caldwell saw her face clearly for the first time. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 30, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sadness and rage. Beautiful, he realized with surprise, and absolutely merciless. "You hunted a woman with a newborn baby," she continued. "Shot her in the back and left her to die in the mud. What did you think would happen? Did you think there would be no consequence, no one to care?" "She was property," Caldwell said, but the words felt hollow, even to him. "We were following the law." "Your law?" Salali stood, the child in her arms, watching Caldwell with eyes that seemed far too aware for something so young. "Not mine, not his, not the law of this land before you came with your guns and your greed." Caldwell raised his rifle. "I'm taking that child. He belongs to no one." Salali's voice was cold as winter stone. "He is free, as his mother wished, as I promised her when she died. You were there, when I held her hand while she bled," Salali said softly. "I heard her last words. Save him," she said. "Don't let them make him a slave." So I took him. I gave him a name. I made him mine. And I will protect him with everything I am, everything I know, everything my people learned in 1,000 years of living in these mountains." The child reached up, touching Salali's face, and Caldwell saw something pass between them, a connection, a bond deeper than blood. This woman had become this child's mother in every way that mattered, and she would kill to keep him safe. "They'll never stop looking," Caldwell heard himself say. "Hartwell will send more hunters. They'll search every inch of these mountains. Then they'll die like Webb died, like you're going to die." Salali's eyes hardened. "Unless you make a choice." "What choice?" "Leave this place. Tell them you found nothing. Tell them the baby died. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. But leave us alone. Do that, and you live. Come back or send others, and you'll join Webb in the river." Caldwell should have laughed, should have pulled the trigger, should have done 100 things that made sense according to the world he knew. But standing in that cave, looking at the woman who moved like smoke and the child who shouldn't exist, he found himself believing that she could do exactly what she promised. Believing that some forces were stronger than law or guns or the will of desperate men. He lowered his rifle. "If I do this," he said slowly, "if I lie for you, you leave me alone. Leave Pierce alone. We're done." "You're done when I say you're done," Salali replied. "But yes, go home, live your life, forget this place, forget us, and maybe, if you're very lucky, you'll die of old age in your bed instead of drowning in the river with clay on your chest." It wasn't mercy. It was a threat wrapped in clemency, but it was also the best offer Caldwell was going to get. He backed toward the passage, keeping his rifle ready but not aimed, watching as Salali sat back down by the fire with the child. She resumed her singing, that ancient lullaby that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself, and Caldwell realized she'd already dismissed him. He was no longer a threat. Just another man who'd glimpsed something he couldn't understand and chosen survival over pride. He climbed back down the waterfall and started the long walk home. And with every step, he felt the weight of what he'd seen pressing down on him, changing him in ways he couldn't yet name. He'd come to these mountains to hunt, but in the end, he was the one who'd been hunted, tracked not by weapons, but by something far more ancient, the justice of a mother protecting her child. When he reached Watkinsville 3 days later, Caldwell told everyone the baby had died, exposure probably, or wild animals. He'd found signs of a Cherokee woman in the mountains, but she was long gone, probably heading west to join her people. There was nothing more to be done. Most people believed him. Those who didn't kept their doubts quiet. John Pierce looked at him with knowing eyes, but said nothing. They never spoke of it again, and deep in the mountains, in a cave behind a waterfall, Salali rocked the boy and sang him songs in a language that was dying but not dead, teaching him the old ways, preparing him for a life that would be lived between two worlds, neither slave nor free, neither Cherokee nor African, but something new, something necessary, something that would survive long after the hunters and the laws and the injustices had faded into history. She'd saved one, and he would save many. That was her promise. That was her purpose, and she would see it through, no matter how many men she had to bury to keep it. Winter came hard to the Georgia mountains that year. Snow fell in November, unusual for the region, blanketing the hills in white silence. In Watkinsville, people huddled around fires and spoke in hushed tones about the strange season, about Webb's death, about the Cherokee woman in the mountains. Some said she'd brought the cold with her, a spirit of winter and vengeance. Others dismissed it as superstition, though they bolted their doors at night just the same. Thomas Caldwell tried to return to his normal life, but sleep didn't come easily anymore. He'd wake in the darkness, certain he could hear singing from the mountains, that lullaby threading through the wind. His wife noticed his distraction, his jumping at shadows, but she asked no questions. Some silences were safer than the truth. It was John Pierce who broke first. Caldwell found him on Christmas Eve, sitting in the abandoned church on the edge of town, drunk and weeping. The young man looked 10 years older than he had 2 months ago, his hands shaking, his eyes haunted. "I can't do this anymore," Pierce said when he saw Caldwell. "I can't sleep, can't eat. Every time I close my eyes, I see her, see that baby. I keep thinking about what we did, about that woman we shot." "We followed the law," Caldwell said, but the words tasted like ash in his mouth. "The law," Pierce laughed bitterly. "You know what I realized? My whole life I thought the law meant right, thought if something was legal, it must be just. But shooting a woman in the back for running away with her own child, how is that right? How is any of this right?" Caldwell sat down beside him on the cold pew. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the broken windows. "What happened to us in those woods? It wasn't natural. She did something to us, made us see things. Did she?" Pierce turned to look at him. "Or did she just make us finally see what we'd been doing all along? We hunt people, Caldwell, human beings, mothers and babies, and we do it for money and call it law and sleep fine at night, until someone makes us look at it, really look at it." "You need to go home," Caldwell said quietly. "Sleep it off. Forget about this." "I can't forget. Don't you understand? I've been going over it and over it. That woman we killed, she ran because she didn't want her baby to grow up a slave. What mother wouldn't do that? What father? If it was your child, wouldn't you run? Wouldn't you fight?" Caldwell had no answer for that. He stood to leave, but Pierce grabbed his arm. "I'm going back," the young man said, "back to the mountains. I'm going to find her and apologize. Tell her I'm sorry for what we did. Maybe then I can sleep again. Don't be a fool. You heard what she said. We leave her alone. We live. That was the deal. I don't want her forgiveness for me, Pierce said. I want it for that woman we murdered. Someone should say sorry. Someone should acknowledge what we took from her. He left the church before Caldwell could stop him, disappearing into the falling snow. Caldwell thought about following, but didn't. Some men were determined to face their demons, and maybe Pierce needed this. Maybe they all did. 3 days later, Pierce's horse returned to his father's farm alone, its saddle empty. A search party went looking, but the snow had covered any tracks. They found him a week into January, sitting against a tree near the old creek bed, where they'd first shot the runaway woman. He was frozen solid, his face peaceful, and in his hands was a bundle of dried flowers, Cherokee wildflowers that didn't bloom in winter, wrapped in river grass and tied with deer sinew. There was no mark of violence on him. No red clay or feathers, just the flowers and a small piece of birch bark tucked into his coat pocket with words carved in careful English. She heard you. She forgives you. Now forgive yourself. The town buried Pierce in the churchyard, and the preacher spoke about the dangers of wandering alone in winter. But Caldwell knew the truth. Pierce had found what he was looking for, not punishment, but something harder to achieve: absolution. After the funeral, Caldwell finally told his wife everything, about the forest, the baby, Salali, and the deal he'd made. She listened in silence, her face unreadable, and when he finished, she said only, "Good, you did the right thing." "Did I?" "Pierce is dead. Webb is dead." Webb died because he couldn't stop boasting about hunting human beings like they were animals. Pierce died because his conscience broke him. You're alive because you made a choice to walk away. That takes its own kind of courage. She was right, but it didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. The months passed. Spring came, melting the snow and bringing green back to the hills. Life in Watkinsville returned to normal, or as normal as it could be, with 2 men dead, and a third haunted by memories of a Cherokee woman in the mountains. Caldwell gave up hunting. He told people his eyes were going bad, that his aim wasn't what it used to be, but really he just couldn't stomach it anymore. The thought of tracking anything, even a deer, made him sick. But others weren't so changed. In April, a new slave hunter arrived in town, a man named Virgil Kane from South Carolina, with a reputation for being the best in the business. He'd tracked runaways from Virginia to Florida, always brought them back, never failed. He was expensive but worth it, people said. And he had no patience for stories about Cherokee spirits or mysterious women in the woods. "Superstitious nonsense," Kane announced in the tavern, his cold eyes scanning the room. "There ain't no magic, there ain't no spirits, just people, and every person can be found if you know how to track them." Someone mentioned the baby from the Hartwell plantation, told him the story. Kane listened, his expression never changing, and when the tale was done, he simply nodded. "A Cherokee woman living in the mountains with a stolen slave child. That's what you're telling me?" "That's the story," the bartender confirmed nervously, "but most folks think it's best to just leave it be. Strange things happen in those woods." "Strange things happen everywhere," Kane replied. "Usually because someone's being careless or stupid. I'm neither." Caldwell, sitting in the corner nursing a whiskey, felt his stomach clench. The child would be 3 years old now, maybe 4. Hardly worth the trouble. Kane looked at him with eyes like flint. "You Caldwell? The one who tracked it first?" "I am, and I'm telling you it's not worth it. Those mountains are dangerous. Men have died." "Men die everywhere," Kane interrupted. "Usually because they don't know what they're doing. I do, and I'm going into those mountains tomorrow. Anybody wants to come along? I'm paying $10 a day." No one volunteered. Kane left alone at dawn, riding a big roan gelding and carrying enough supplies for a month in the wilderness. Caldwell watched him go and felt a cold dread settle in his chest. He'd seen men like Kane before, men who believed in nothing but their own skill, who thought being good at violence made them invincible. They usually learned different, but by then it was too late. He should have let it go, should have stayed home and hoped that Kane was as good as he claimed. But the image of Pierce frozen against that tree kept haunting him, and the memory of Salali's eyes in the cave, and the child who'd grown impossibly fast and watched him with awareness far beyond its years. This wasn't going to end well. He knew it in his bones. On the third day after Kane left, Caldwell saddled his horse and followed. The trail wasn't hard to find. Kane had made no effort to hide his tracks, confident in his own abilities. Caldwell followed them north into the high country, watching the signs and trying to guess where the hunter would go. Not to the cave behind the waterfall. That was too obvious. And besides, Caldwell had never told anyone about it. But there were other places, other signs someone living in these mountains would leave. He found Kane on the fourth day, camped in a hollow near a stream. The hunter had his rifle across his knees and was studying something in his hand, a piece of birch bark with symbols carved into it. Cherokee writing. "You're following me," Kane said without looking up. "Why?" "To stop you from making a mistake. That woman killed 2 men from this town. Or are you going to tell me that's superstition too? I'm telling you she's protecting a child. And she's got reason to hate men like us. You go after her, you won't come back." Eyes. Kane finally looked at him, his face expressionless. "Men like us? You mean hunters? Or you mean something else?" Caldwell dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby tree. "I mean men who make their living off other people's suffering, who treat human beings like property, who shoot mothers in the back and call it duty." "Interesting," Kane said softly. "You feel guilty, Caldwell? That why you're here, want to protect the Cherokee woman to make up for killing the Negro one?" "I want to prevent more death. There's been enough." "There'll be enough when I say there's enough." Kane stood, tucking the birch bark into his coat. "That woman's been leaving me messages. Warnings, I suppose, telling me to turn back. But see, I don't speak Cherokee, and even if I did, I wouldn't listen. I've got a job to do, and I always finish what I start." "Then you're a fool," Caldwell said bluntly, "and you're going to die in these woods." "Maybe," Kane smiled, and it was the coldest expression Caldwell had ever seen on a human face. "But not today. Now get out of my camp before I decide you're more trouble than you're worth." Caldwell left, but he didn't go far. He made his own camp a mile away and waited, watching the smoke from Kane's fire, wondering what the hell he was supposed to do. He couldn't fight Kane. The man was younger, harder, and clearly had no compunctions about killing, but he also couldn't just let him walk into Salali's territory and start hunting again. The answer came at midnight. Caldwell woke to find Salali standing at the edge of his camp, the firelight making her face look carved from copper and shadow. She wasn't alone. The boy was with her, and he was bigger now, maybe 5 or 6 years old, growing at that same impossible rate. But what struck Caldwell most was the expression in the child's eyes, awareness, intelligence, and something that looked almost like pity. "You came to warn me," Salali said. "It wasn't a question. Why?" "Because enough people have died," Caldwell replied, his heart hammering. "Because Kane won't stop. He'll keep coming until he finds you or he's dead, and either way there'll be more blood, and I'm tired of blood." Salali studied him for a long moment. "You've changed. The last time we met you were ready to kill me to get this child. Now you risk yourself to protect us. What happened?" "Pierce happened. Webb happened. I happened. I looked at what I'd become and didn't like it. So now you want redemption?" There was no mockery in her voice, just observation. "You want to save us to save yourself." "Maybe," Caldwell admitted. "Or maybe I just want to do one thing right before I die." The boy stepped forward then, and when he spoke, his voice was clear and strong, with none of the hesitation of childhood. "He's telling the truth. His heart has changed." Caldwell stared at the child, stunned. "How old are you?" "Old enough," the boy replied. "Time moves differently in sacred places. Grandmother says I'm growing into my destiny, that I'll be ready soon." "Ready for what?" Salali put her hand on the boy's shoulder. "Ready to fulfill his mother's hope, that he would save many." But first he must survive. She looked at Caldwell. This hunter, Kane, he's different from the others, stronger, more determined. I know, that's why I'm here. Then help me end this. Tonight. Before he gets any closer to finding us. Caldwell felt ice slide down his spine. You want me to help you kill him? I want you to help me give him a choice, Salali corrected. The same choice I gave you. Walk away or die. But this time, I want a witness. Someone who can tell the others that this is finished, that anyone else who comes hunting will meet the same fate. It was madness. It was probably murder. It definitely violated every law Caldwell knew. But looking at Salali and the boy, he realized he was going to do it anyway, because maybe this was his redemption. Maybe this was how he paid for the woman they'd shot, for the baby they'd tried to take, for all the years of hunting people like animals. Tell me what you need me to do, he said. Salali smiled, and for the first time it wasn't the smile of a predator. It was the smile of someone who'd found an unexpected ally. Follow me, she said, and watch how justice works in the old way. They moved through the darkness like shadows, 3 figures in the forest, the Cherokee woman, the child who grew too fast, and the hunter who'd learned too late that some prey shouldn't be hunted. Caldwell followed Salali through terrain so rough he would have been lost within minutes on his own, but she moved with absolute confidence, never hesitating, always knowing exactly where to step. The boy kept pace beside her, silent and watchful, his eyes reflecting moonlight like an animal's. They reached Kane's camp an hour before dawn. The hunter was asleep in his bedroll, his rifle within arm's reach, his horse picketed nearby. A careful man, even in sleep, but not careful enough. Salali signaled for Caldwell to stay back, then moved forward, alone. She was within 10 feet of Kane when he woke, coming instantly alert, his hand reaching for his rifle. But before he could grasp it, she spoke a single word in Cherokee, and the weapon seemed to leap from his reach, clattering against a rock 15 feet away. Kane rolled to his feet, a knife appearing in his hand with practiced speed. He crouched, eyes scanning the darkness, finding Salali standing in the shadows at the edge of his camp. "Cherokee woman," he said, his voice calm despite the situation. "Decided to save me the trouble of tracking you?" "Decided to give you the same choice I gave the others," Salali replied, stepping into the firelight. "Leave these mountains. Leave us alone. Tell the white men in the towns that the baby is dead, that I'm gone, that this is finished. Do that, and you live." Kane laughed, cold and humorless. "Or what? You'll kill me like you killed Webb? Leave me marked with feathers and clay?" He shifted his grip on the knife. "I've heard the stories. Cherokee magic, spirits in the woods, all that nonsense. But you're just a woman, and women bleed like anyone else." He moved then, faster than Caldwell expected, lunging forward with the knife aimed at Salali's throat. But she was faster. She sidestepped the attack with minimal movement, and as Kane stumbled past her, she struck him once in the back of the neck with the edge of her hand. The hunter went down hard, his knife spinning away into the darkness. "You're right," Salali said, standing over him as he struggled to breathe, temporarily paralyzed by the strike. "I'm just a woman, but I was taught by warriors who fought for this land long before your people came with your laws and your guns and your certainty that violence makes you strong. You want to know what real strength is? It's protecting what you love. It's surviving when the world wants you dead. It's being a woman alone in the wilderness with a stolen child and making it work anyway." She knelt beside Kane, her face inches from his. "Webb died because he couldn't stop bragging about hunting children. Pierce died because his guilt broke him, though I tried to heal that guilt, tried to show him forgiveness. But you're different. You don't feel guilt. You don't feel anything except pride in your own skill, so I'm going to teach you feeling." Salali placed her hand on Kane's chest, over his heart, and closed her eyes. She began to sing, that same lullaby Caldwell had heard in the cave, and as she sang, something changed in the air. The temperature dropped. The fire flickered and dimmed, and Kane's eyes went wide with terror as something invisible seized him. Caldwell watched, transfixed, as the hunter's body began to convulse. Kane's mouth opened in a soundless scream, his back arching, his fingers clawing at the earth. Salali kept singing, her voice steady and remorseless, and Caldwell realized she was making him feel it. Every moment of suffering her people had endured, every loss, every death, every injustice. The trail of tears, compressed into minutes, poured directly into Kane's mind and heart. When she finally stopped singing and removed her hand, Kane lay gasping like a landed fish, tears streaming down his face. The paralysis had worn off, but he made no move to attack, no attempt to flee. He just lay there, broken by understanding, shattered by empathy he'd never known before. "That," Salali said quietly, "is what we carry. Every day, every hour, the weight of what was taken from us. The pain of watching our world die, and you wanted to add to it. You wanted to take the one thing I saved, the one child I protected, and drag him back to slavery." "I didn't know," Kane whispered, his voice destroyed. "I didn't understand." "No," Salali agreed, "you didn't. None of you do. You see property, not people. You see law, not justice. You see right to take, not obligation to protect." She stood, looking down at him with something that might have been pity. "Now you know. Now you understand. The question is, what will you do with that understanding?" Kane struggled to sit up, his whole body shaking. He looked at Salali, then at Caldwell, who'd emerged from the shadows, then at the boy who stood watching with those two old eyes. "I'll leave," he managed. "I'll tell them the baby died. I'll say I found nothing. Just please, please don't make me feel that again." "I won't have to," Salali said. "You'll feel it every day for the rest of your life. Every time you see a slave, you'll remember. Every time you hear about the Cherokee, you'll remember. That's your punishment and your teacher. Learn from it, or let it destroy you. That's your choice." She turned away, taking the boy's hand, preparing to leave. But Caldwell stepped forward. "Wait," he said. "I need to know something. The boy, what are you training him for? What's his destiny?" Salali looked at him for a long moment, then nodded to the child. The boy stepped forward and spoke, his voice carrying a weight beyond his years. "My mother died wanting me to be free. Salali saved me and gave me that freedom. But freedom means nothing if you only use it for yourself. So I'm learning. Learning Cherokee ways and African ways, learning white man's language and laws, learning medicine and tracking and how to move through the world that wants to break people like me." "Why?" Caldwell asked. "Because more will come," the boy said simply. "More babies born into slavery, more mothers desperate to save them, more people running north, looking for freedom. And someone needs to help them, someone who understands both worlds, someone who can guide them, protect them, show them how to survive." "You're making him into a conductor," Caldwell breathed, understanding, "for the Underground Railroad." "I'm making him into what he needs to be," Salali corrected. "A bridge between worlds, a protector of the lost. When the time comes, when he's ready, he'll walk both the white world and the hidden places. He'll speak the languages of the slave and the Cherokee and the free man, and he'll save many, just as his mother hoped." She looked at Caldwell and Kane. "That's what you hunted. That's what you tried to kill before it could even begin. A chance for something better. A life dedicated to helping others find freedom. Now tell me, which of you has a purpose that noble?" Neither man had an answer. Salali and the boy disappeared into the forest, leaving Caldwell and Kane alone by the dying fire. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and in that light, Caldwell could see how much older Kane looked. The arrogance was gone, burned away by whatever Salali had made him feel. What remained was just a man, broken and remade, trying to figure out how to live with new understanding. "Did that really happen?" Kane asked finally. "Or did she drug me somehow? Make me hallucinate? Does it matter?" Caldwell replied. "You felt it. You know it now. Whether it was magic or medicine or something else entirely, the truth is the same. We've been living our lives causing suffering and calling it duty. That ends now. It has to." Kane nodded slowly. "What do we tell them? Back in town?" "We tell them the truth, that the baby died, the Cherokee woman is gone, and anyone who goes looking for either of them is a fool. We tell them to let it rest, to move on." Caldwell paused. "And then we start figuring out how to live with what we've learned." They packed up Kane's camp in silence and started the long ride back to civilization. Behind them, the mountains held their secrets close, and somewhere in those hidden places, a boy was learning to be extraordinary, learning to take the worst thing that could have happened to him, being born into slavery, and transform it into purpose. His mother had run and died to give him a chance. Salali had risked everything to save him, and now he would honor both of them by becoming something the world desperately needed. A bridge between the enslaved and the free, a guide for those seeking safety, a symbol that even in the darkest times, hope could survive. Years later, people would speak of a mysterious figure who helped slaves escape, a man who moved like a ghost through the forests, who seemed to know every hidden path and safe house, who could vanish into thin air when pursued. Some said he had Cherokee magic, others claimed he could speak to animals. A few whispered that he'd been raised by spirits in the mountains and was more than human. They were all wrong and all right. He was just a boy who'd been saved by love and raised by courage, using the gifts he'd been given to pass that grace forward. That was the real magic. That was the truth behind the legend. But Caldwell and Kane knew better. They'd seen where he came from, seen what he'd survived, seen the woman who'd made the impossible possible through sheer force of will and love. And whenever they heard the stories in the years that followed, they'd remember that night in the mountains and stay silent. Some secrets were meant to be kept, some heroes were meant to remain anonymous. That's how legends were born. 10 years passed. The boy became a young man, though the exact count of his years remained mysterious. Those who saw him in those later years, and few did, for he moved mostly at night and avoided being noticed, would have guessed him to be in his late teens, though mathematically he should have been barely 13. Time had continued its strange work on him, or perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was simply that someone living the life he lived grew up faster, in ways that went beyond physical years. Salali had taught him everything she knew: how to read the forest for signs of pursuit, how to move without sound through underbrush, how to find water and food and shelter in places others would see only wilderness. But more than that, she'd taught him the deeper lessons, the ones about patience and compassion, about when to fight and when to disappear, about carrying pain without letting it poison you. "Anger is like a fire," she told him one winter night as they sat in the cave that had become their home. "It can warm you or burn you. The choice is always yours." He'd learned to read and write from books she'd somehow acquired, stolen from abandoned homesteads, traded for with rare herbs, or gifted by the few whites who still sympathized with the Cherokee cause. He studied maps until he could navigate by stars and memory. He learned the Underground Railroad signals and safe houses, memorizing a network of freedom that stretched from Georgia to Canada. But most importantly, Salali taught him about both sides of his heritage. About the African kingdoms his mother's ancestors came from, great civilizations with their own wisdom and power. About the Cherokee people's connection to the land, their understanding of balance and respect. She taught him that he didn't have to choose between these identities. He could be both, could draw strength from both, could honor both in everything he did. "You are a bridge," she told him. "Bridges don't belong to one side or the other. They serve both. Remember that when times are hard, His first rescue happened by accident. He was 16 or perhaps 13, depending on how you counted, when he heard screaming from the river valley. He found a young woman, maybe 20 years old, trapped in the shallows with a broken ankle and slave catchers closing in from 3 directions. The smart thing would have been to hide, to stay hidden, to remember that Salali's first rule was survive. But the woman's face reminded him of someone he'd never met, his mother, dying in the mud with a baby in her arms, hoping against hope that someone would save what she couldn't. He made a choice. The rescue was chaotic and improvised, and nearly got him caught twice. But he managed it, leading the woman through passages even the best trackers couldn't follow, carrying her when she couldn't walk, finally delivering her to a Quaker family 40 miles north who were part of the network. The woman never learned his name. He never asked for hers, but as he left, she grabbed his hand and whispered, "Thank you. God bless you." He'd thought about that blessing for days afterward. He'd been raised with Cherokee spirituality, but his mother had been Christian, and the people he was helping were Christian, and he wondered if all these different gods were really just different names for the same thing. The force that made people risk everything to help each other. The power that turned ordinary people into heroes. After that first rescue, others followed. Word spread in the careful way it spread among the enslaved, whispered in slave quarters, shared between trusted friends, passed along the network. A guardian in the mountains, a young man who could find you when you were lost, lead you when you were hunted, hide you when all seemed hopeless. He had many names in different communities. Some called him the Cherokee Walker, others called him the Night Guide, some just called him Freedom. He never told anyone about Salali. That was their agreement. Her safety depended on remaining a myth, a story, a legend that might or might not be true. But his work depended on being just real enough that desperate people would risk calling for help. The system worked. Over the years, he'd guided dozens of people north, families with children, elderly men and women who thought they'd die in bondage, young people full of dreams for the life they'd build in freedom. Each one was a victory. Each one proved that his mother's sacrifice had meaning, that Salali's choice to save him had rippled outward into grace for others. But the work took its toll. By the time he was 18 or 15, or perhaps some age that existed outside normal counting, he'd been shot at, nearly drowned, almost captured more times than he could count. He had scars across his back from a whip when he'd been caught once and had to fight his way free. He had a knife wound in his shoulder from a bounty hunter who'd gotten too close. He had nightmares about the faces of people he couldn't save, the ones who'd been caught despite his best efforts, the children torn from parents, the hope dying in people's eyes when the dogs got too close. Salali watched him carry this burden and worried. One night, when he returned to their cave exhausted and wounded from a particularly difficult rescue, she confronted him. "You're going to get yourself killed," she said bluntly, cleaning the fresh cut on his arm where a bullet had grazed him. "And then everything, your mother's hope, my protection, all the people you could still help, all of it ends." "Would you have me stop?" he asked. "Go back to hiding, let people suffer when I could help?" "I would have you be smart," she replied. "You're one person. You can't save everyone. If you burn yourself out trying, you save no one." "My mother died trying to save me. You risked everything to give me a chance. How can I do less for others?" Salali was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "Your mother didn't die so you could throw your life away on impossible odds. She died so you could live, really live. Yes, help others. That's your calling, your purpose. But you can't help anyone if you're dead. You need to be more careful. You need to think longer term." "How?" he asked. "How do I help more while risking less?" "You stop working alone," Salali said. "You find others who share your purpose. Build a network. Teach them what you know. One person can save dozens, but many people, working together, they can save hundreds, thousands." It was good advice, and he knew it, but the problem was trust. Most white abolitionists meant well but couldn't move through slave territory without being noticed. Most free black people were carefully watched, their movements restricted, and escaped slaves themselves were hunted, vulnerable, unable to risk returning south. The solution came from an unexpected source. One of the people he'd helped escape, a woman named Hannah, who'd been a house slave in Savannah, had made it all the way to Philadelphia and established herself there. She'd learned to read and write, had become active in abolitionist circles, and she remembered the young man who'd guided her through the Georgia mountains. When she heard Frederick Douglass speak about the need for more Underground Railroad conductors, she thought of him. Hannah managed to get a message south through the network, asking if he'd consider traveling north to meet with abolitionists who wanted to help fund and organize the work. Salali encouraged him to go. "This is your chance," she said, "to become more than just one man helping one person at a time, to become part of something bigger." He was reluctant to leave her, reluctant to leave the mountains that had been his home for so long, but he also knew she was right. So in the spring of 1848, when he looked about 20 years old, but had been born only 18 years earlier, if time had worked normally, he made the long journey north. Philadelphia amazed him. He'd seen small towns and farmland, had skirted around cities in his work, but he'd never been inside a place like this. The noise, the crowds, the sheer number of people living in close proximity, it was overwhelming. But what struck him most was seeing black people walking freely, working in shops, going about their business without looking over their shoulders for slave catchers. This was what he was fighting for. This was the promise of freedom his mother had died to give him. Hannah met him at a boarding house run by a Quaker family. She barely recognized him at first. He'd been just a teenager when he guided her north, and now he looked like a man grown. But his eyes were the same, still carrying that peculiar awareness that seemed older than his years. "You came," she said, embracing him. "I wasn't sure you would." "Salali said it was time," he replied. "Time to stop being a secret and start being a movement." Over the next few weeks, he met with leaders of the abolitionist movement. William Still, who kept meticulous records of everyone who passed through Philadelphia. Robert Purvis, who'd inherited wealth and used it to fund freedom. Lucretia Mott, whose Quaker faith demanded action, and others, black and white, men and women, all united in the belief that slavery was evil and must be fought. They wanted to hear his stories, learn his methods, understand how he'd survived so long doing such dangerous work. He told them about the forests, the hidden paths, the Cherokee techniques Salali had taught him. He explained how to read pursuers, how to cover tracks, how to move people who were exhausted or injured or terrified. But more than tactics, they wanted to know about him, who he was, where he came from. How a young man of mixed Cherokee and African heritage had become one of the most effective conductors on the Underground Railroad. He told them a version of the truth, about being born to an enslaved woman who'd run to save him, about being raised in the mountains by someone who taught him to survive. He didn't mention Salali by name, didn't describe the cave or the exact location. Some secrets remained necessary. What emerged from those meetings was a plan. He would continue his work in the South, but now he'd be part of a coordinated network. He'd have contacts in every major city along the route. He'd have safe houses he could count on, resources he could draw from, information about which areas were being heavily watched and which were safer. Most importantly, he'd have people he could train, teach, and trust to carry on the work. "You've been a lone wolf," William Still told him. "That served you well. But wolves are stronger in packs. Let us be your pack." He returned to Georgia in the fall, carrying with him new confidence and new connections. Salali saw the change in him immediately. "You found your tribe," she said, smiling. "Good. Now you're ready for what comes next." "What comes next?" Her smile faded, replaced by something sadder. "War is coming. Anyone with eyes can see it. The question of slavery can't be answered with words anymore. It's going to be answered with blood. And when that happens, the work you're doing, the people you're saving, that becomes more important than ever. She was right, of course. The tensions between North and South were growing. The Compromise of 1850 had only delayed the inevitable. The Kansas-Nebraska Act would further inflame passions. Everyone could feel it building. The sense that something had to break, that the nation couldn't remain half slave and half free forever. But until that breaking came, there was work to do. People to save, hope to preserve, one person at a time, one family at a time, one desperate dash for freedom at a time. He continued his work through the 1850s, but now with greater support and reach. He trained others in his techniques, young black men and women who were willing to risk everything to help their people. He established new routes and safe houses. He learned to coordinate with conductors in other regions, creating a network that spanned hundreds of miles. The numbers grew. In his first 5 years, he'd saved perhaps 30 people. In the next 5, working with others, the number climbed into the hundreds. Not all of them were his direct rescues, but all of them were helped by the network he'd helped build, the knowledge he'd shared, the inspiration he provided by example. Salali watched from the mountains, proud and worried in equal measure. He visited her less frequently now. The work demanded so much of his time. But when he came, she made sure he rested, reminded him to care for himself, told him stories about his mother and about Cherokee heroes and about the importance of balance. "You're doing good work," she told him during one visit in 1857. "Important work, but don't forget to live too. Don't forget there's more to life than sacrifice." "Is there?" he asked. "For someone like me?" "For everyone," she replied firmly. "Even heroes need joy, especially heroes. Otherwise, what are you fighting for? Just the idea of freedom, or the reality of life with all its messiness and laughter and love?" He thought about that for a long time. He was 27 years old now, or 17, or perhaps some age that existed in the space between numbers and stories. Old enough to have saved hundreds of people. Old enough to have scars that would never fully heal. Old enough to wonder if Salali was right, if he'd been so focused on fighting for life that he'd forgotten to live one. But there was still work to do. Still people who needed help. Still a system of oppression that ground human beings into property and called it civilization. How could he rest while that continued? After the war, he promised her. When the war comes and settles this, when slavery is finally ended, then I'll rest. Then I'll figure out how to just live. Salali touched his face gently. "Don't wait too long. Life has a way of passing while you're planning to live it." She was wise, as always, but he was young, and young people always believe there will be more time. More time to rest, more time to figure things out, more time to become who you're meant to be. War did come, just as Salali predicted. In April 1861, shots were fired at Fort Sumter, and the nation tore itself apart. The Civil War had begun, and with it, the final chapter of the story that had started with a baby crying in a Georgia forest and a Cherokee woman who chose to save him. The war changed everything and nothing. Slavery's death was written in the declaration of war, though 4 years of blood would be required to make that death real. For the young man who'd spent his life guiding people to freedom, the war meant new dangers and new opportunities in equal measure. The Confederacy cracked down hard on anyone suspected of helping slaves escape. Patrols increased, penalties grew harsher. More than one conductor was caught and executed as an example. But the chaos of war also created openings. Troops were diverted to fighting, resources stretched thin, and in the confusion, it became easier to move people if you were careful and smart. He continued his work, but now with military significance. The Union Army wanted intelligence from behind Confederate lines, wanted to know troop movements and supply routes. Escaped slaves provided that information, and he provided the slaves. It was a strange partnership. He had no love for the Union Army, knew they'd happily returned escaped slaves before the war, knew their fight was more about preserving the nation than freeing the enslaved. But they were also the force that would end slavery, so he worked with them. Thomas Caldwell watched the war from his farm, too old now to fight, but not too old to remember. He thought often about that night in the cave, about the Cherokee woman and the stolen baby, about the promise that the child would save many. He wondered if the young man was still alive, still working, still fighting. Part of him hoped not, hoped the boy had found peace somewhere, found safety. But another part, the part that had been changed by those events, hoped the legend was true. One night in 1863, Caldwell got his answer. There was a knock on his door well after midnight, the kind of knock that meant trouble or danger or both. He opened it to find a young black man standing there, exhausted and wounded, with 2 children huddled behind him. "Are you Thomas Caldwell?" the man asked. "I am." "Then I was told to come here, told you owed a debt and would honor it." Caldwell looked at the children, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 8 years old, their eyes huge with fear and hope. He knew what was being asked, knew that saying yes meant risking everything, his property, his freedom, possibly his life. The Confederacy didn't look kindly on white men who harbored runaway slaves. But he also remembered a promise made in a cave, remembered a woman who'd given him a chance to be better than he was, remembered the weight of guilt that had taken years to ease. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. Quickly, he hid them in his barn, gave them food and clean water, tended the man's wounds. As he worked, he asked, "Who sent you to me?" "The night guide," the man replied. "The one they say moves like smoke. He got us across the river, past the patrols. But he was leading others too, couldn't take us all the way north. Said he knew a white man near here who'd help. Said to tell you that Salali remembers the choice you made and that debts run both ways." Caldwell felt tears prick his eyes. After all these years, she'd remembered. Had remembered that he'd made the right choice in the end, had walked away rather than fight, had warned her about Cain, and now she was calling in that debt, not for herself, but for others who needed help. "I'll get you north," Caldwell said. "I know people. It'll take a few days, but I'll see it done." He kept his word. 3 days later, the man and children were on their way to Pennsylvania, guided by a network Caldwell had carefully built over the years. He'd been too old and too guilty to work as a conductor, but he'd done what he could, providing shelter, supplies, information, small redemptions for large sins. The man survived and made it to freedom. Years later, he would tell his children about the night guide who'd saved them, and about the old white man who'd risked everything to finish what the guide had started. The stories would blend and grow, becoming part of the larger narrative of people who'd fought for freedom in small ways and large. The war ground on. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and suddenly the war was officially about ending slavery. The young man felt something shift when he heard the news, a sense that the work was changing, that the long night was finally ending. There were still battles to fight, still people who needed saving. But the direction was clear now. Freedom was coming. Salali didn't live to see the war's end. In the winter of 1864, he returned to the cave to find her sick with pneumonia, her breathing labored, her body failing. He cared for her as she'd once cared for him, trying every medicine he knew, calling on every bit of knowledge she'd taught him. But some things couldn't be fixed. Some endings were inevitable. "Don't mourn," she told him one night, her voice weak but still carrying that iron core. "I've lived longer than I expected, saved more than I hoped. This is enough." "It's not enough," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved me, saved hundreds through me. You deserve to see the end of this." I'm seeing it now." She touched his face with a trembling hand. "Seeing you, the boy who cried in the forest, has become a man who brings hundreds out of bondage. You are the end I was working toward. You are the victory." She died 2 days later, peaceful in the end, surrounded by the artifacts of 2 peoples, Cherokee medicine bags and African talismans, objects he'd collected over the years from the people he'd saved. She'd been a bridge between worlds, and in death, those worlds honored her equally. He buried her in the cave that had been their home, sealing the entrance afterward so it would become her tomb. He marked it with symbols from both their peoples and his own, Cherokee, African, and something new, something that represented what they'd built together. Then he walked away, carrying only what he could pack, leaving his childhood behind. The war ended in April 1865. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and slowly, painfully, the nation began to knit itself back together. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, making it officially illegal throughout the United States. The work that had driven him for his entire conscious life was done, or so it seemed, but freedom on paper wasn't the same as freedom in practice. He learned that quickly. The former Confederate states implemented black codes to restrict the rights of freed slaves. Violence against black people increased. The Ku Klux Klan formed, using terror to try to restore white supremacy. Reconstruction was supposed to rebuild the South and guarantee rights for the freed slaves, but it was a brutal, contested process. The young man, now in his mid-30s by regular counting, though he looked older, worn down by decades of hard living, had to decide what his role would be in this new world. The Underground Railroad was no longer needed, but justice was still required. He settled in Tennessee, in the mountains that reminded him of his childhood home. He bought land with money provided by grateful abolitionists who'd funded his work during the war. He built a simple house, planted crops, and to outward appearances became just another farmer trying to make a living. But at night, he rode out to protect black families from night riders. He taught freed slaves to read and write, violating laws that tried to keep them ignorant. He helped establish schools and churches, building institutions that would outlast any individual. He used every skill Salali had taught him: tracking, hiding, fighting when necessary, disappearing when prudent, but now in service of protecting freedom rather than achieving it. The work was different, but equally necessary, and he was no longer alone. The people he'd saved over the years, now free and building new lives, many of them joined him. They formed a network of protection and support, watching over communities, defending against those who wanted to return them to bondage in all but name. In 1871, Thomas Caldwell died at age 73, having spent his final years as a quiet supporter of black education and civil rights. Few knew the full extent of his transformation from slave hunter to abolitionist, but those who did spoke of him with respect. He'd proven that people could change, that doing wrong didn't mean you were forever defined by it. At Caldwell's funeral, a tall black man in his late 30s arrived unexpectedly, standing at the back of the gathering. Several of Caldwell's children noticed him, noticed the way he stood still and silent through the service. After it ended, he placed a single hawk feather on the grave and walked away. No one knew who he was, but the older residents whispered that it was the night guide, paying respects to a man who'd made the right choice when it mattered. The years continued, Reconstruction failed, and Jim Crow laws rose to replace slavery with segregation. The young man, no longer so young now, approaching 50 by the calendar, though his exact age remained unclear, continued his work. He saved no one from slavery now. Slavery was dead. But he fought to give the freed people tools to build real freedom, education, land ownership, political power. He never married, never had children of his own. When people asked why, he'd say he'd never found the right person, or that his work didn't leave room for family. But the truth was more complicated. How could he bring children into a world still so filled with hatred? How could he ask someone to share his life when that life was still, even now, dedicated to fighting battles that seemed never to end? Salali had warned him about this. She told him not to wait to live, not to sacrifice everything for the cause, but he'd made his choice, and he didn't regret it. The people he'd saved, the families he'd protected, the communities he'd helped build, that was his legacy. That was his life. In his 60s, He began to feel the weight of years finally catching up to him. The scars from old wounds ached, his joints stiffened in the cold. He couldn't move through the forests with the same silent grace he'd once possessed, but his mind remained sharp, and he turned to a new form of activism. Writing. He recorded stories of the Underground Railroad, of the people who'd fought for freedom, of the networks that had saved thousands. He documented techniques and strategies, not for historical interest, but as lessons for future generations who might need to fight their own battles for justice. And he wrote about Salali, about the Cherokee woman who'd saved a baby and changed the course of countless lives by that single act of courage. The manuscript was never published in his lifetime. It was considered too dangerous, too controversial, too likely to inflame racial tensions. But copies circulated among abolition families and black communities, passed from hand to hand, preserved carefully for the day when it could be shared more widely. In 1889, the man who'd been known by many names but claimed none as his own died quietly in his sleep at his Tennessee farm. He was 57 years old by most calculations, 70 by some others, and by the internal count of his experiences, perhaps 100. No newspaper noted his passing. No monument marked his grave. But in black churches across the South, prayers were offered for the night guide, for the Cherokee walker, for freedom himself. They said at his funeral that over 1,000 people had been saved by his direct actions, and tens of thousands more had been helped by the network he'd built and the people he'd trained. They said his mother would have been proud. They said Salali was surely waiting for him, ready to welcome him home to the mountains they'd shared. The stories continued long after his death. Some merged him with other conductors, Harriet Tubman, John Parker, John Fairfield, creating composite legends of heroic action. Others kept him distinct, the mysterious young man of mixed heritage who'd moved like a ghost through the forests, saving the unsavable, protecting the vulnerable, proving that one person could make an impossible difference. In 1924, a group of historians investigating Underground Railroad routes in Georgia rediscovered the sealed cave. Breaking through the barrier, they found it exactly as it had been left. A tomb containing the body of a Cherokee woman, surrounded by artifacts from two cultures. Beneath her body was a carved message in English. She saved one, he saved many. Remember both. The discovery made minor news in academic circles. The cave was photographed, documented, and then sealed again out of respect. A small marker was placed nearby, though the exact location was kept vague to prevent looting. It read simply, "Here rests Salali, Cherokee guardian, friend to the oppressed, mother to the lost. Her courage echoed through generations." In 1965, during the height of the civil rights movement, activists rediscovered the stories of the night guide. Young people marching for equality found inspiration in tales of the young man who'd spent his entire life fighting for justice, who'd never given up despite impossible odds, who'd proven that systems of oppression could be resisted and eventually overcome. The stories spread again, adapted for a new age of struggle. He became a symbol, not just of what one person could do, but of what coalitions could accomplish. His story demonstrated the power of different groups working together, Cherokee and African, black and white, free and enslaved, all united in common cause. Today, the cave remains sealed, a memorial to a woman whose name most people have never heard. The farm in Tennessee has been sold and subdivided, the house long since torn down. There are no statues, no official commemorations, no history books that tell the full story. But in communities across America, grandparents still tell their grandchildren about the night guide, about the baby who was saved and grew up to save many, about the Cherokee woman who chose compassion over caution, about the white hunter who chose redemption over pride, about networks of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And in the Georgia mountains, on nights when the wind moves through the pines just right, people swear they can still hear it. a lullaby in a language most have forgotten, sung by a voice that echoes through the centuries. Some say it's just the wind, others know better. They say Salali still walks those forests, watching over the lost and the frightened, guiding those who need protection. They say the boy she saved still walks there too, forever young, forever vigilant, forever keeping the promise his mother's sacrifice and Salali's courage made possible. They're probably just stories, legends grown from tragedy and triumph, myths created to make sense of suffering and celebrate survival. But sometimes, just sometimes, hikers in those mountains report finding things they can't explain. A path appearing where no path should be, leading them to safety when they're lost. A sense of being watched by friendly eyes when they're afraid. A feeling that these woods, despite their wilderness, are somehow protected by something ancient and good. And in those moments, the stories don't feel like myths at all. They feel like memory, like truth, like the kind of justice that echoes through generations, proving that love is stronger than hatred, courage is stronger than fear, and mercy is the most powerful force in the universe. Salali saved one baby from slave hunters on a misty October night in 1838. That baby became a man who saved over 1,000 people from bondage. Those 1,000 people went on to have children and grandchildren, spreading life and hope forward through time. By some estimates, tens of thousands of people alive today can trace their freedom back to that single moment of choice, when a Cherokee woman heard a baby crying and decided that some lives were worth any risk to save. That's the real magic. That's the true legacy, one act of courage, rippling forward through time, proving that mercy terrifies oppressors because mercy is the beginning of their end. The slave hunters called her a witch. The people she saved called her a mother. History struggles to call her at all because women like her, indigenous, compassionate, dangerous, don't fit neatly into the stories powerful people want to tell. But the truth remains, carried in whispers and songs and stories, passed down through families who know their freedom came at a cost paid by people they never met. People like Salali, people like the boy she saved, people like everyone who chose love over law when law demanded cruelty. They existed, they fought, they won, and somewhere in the Georgia mountains, in a cave no one visits, their legacy sleeps, waiting for the next generation to need inspiration, to need proof that resistance is possible, to need reminding that justice, though slow, though costly, though requiring sacrifice beyond measure, is always, eventually, worth it.